For this week, we're going to be covering interviews and field notes, as well as a variety of other things that kind of get pushed into these areas. So last week, one of the primary goals was to look at your research questions or start thinking about that, right? And as a reminder, this is an education transformation, you know, emphasis. So your research question should be focused on education, and there's a wide range of things that you could do. It could include things such as teaching, right? So maybe you want to talk to a professor and understand the reasons that a sociology professor might become a professor. Maybe you want to think about the ways that COVID-19 impacted high school teachers. Maybe you want to maybe you have a high school teacher that that you had in high school who was a phenomenal teacher, and you want to do a case study on that, right? Or maybe you want to tell the story of a student who started a club and made some sort of transformation in the community. The primary focus is going to be on narrative and case studies. So going to those two readings in the first week that are listed as narrative and case study are going to be crucial to help you understand kind of how and why it would be case study and why it would be narrative. Now, I am going to talk a little bit, even in this lecture, on some of the other reasons that we would engage in things like phenomenological or action research and how those can apply to, the state of education and why specifically qualitative research in education is the focus of this class and why we would need to use it. So before I get into that, one of the things that I really want to reiterate again is that this is an education class, right? This is qualitative research in education. And so while sociology is something that we're using, right? We're doing sociological analysis for it. Um, the reason that we would look at qualitative research for education is that we are trying to understand the lived experiences, the deep, rich details, right? So quantitative and qualitative are two of the major types of research methods that we would use. There are other components such as historical comparative, and there's, that's one example. You can do like policy analysis, but ultimately you're still often doing some sort of qualitative and or quantitative element to it. Again, these are not the only two methods that are in all of existence, but those are the two major ones that we often use. Quantitative is more of your numbers, right? You're looking for relationships between two or more variables. You're developing a hypothesis. You're doing some sort of numerical analysis, which is why thinking about it from a positives perspective, you're really only interested in one or two outcomes. You might be interested in multiple outcomes, but you're not trying to figure out all the other factors. The reason that we use qualitative research in education, we do use quantitative too, but this is a focus on qualitative, is that qualitative allows us to capture stories that are not what's called generalizable. Generalizability is where you're taking something and taking it to understand a larger population and the general population. You're making it to where it's generalizable. You can say stuff, in larger statements around around situations. The intention of qualitative is not for it to be generalizable. The intention of qualitative is to understand deep, complex phenomenon or experiences and to capture the stories and rich details that are included into that. So when it comes to this class, we use qualitative in education specifically because we are trying to understand pedagogical processes, right? So how a teacher will teach something, say they're trying to teach we're trying to understand like which teaching of reading methods are working, or we're trying to understand how a teacher is engaging in dialogue with their students, or maybe we want to understand how teachers collaborated and built camaraderie during COVID-19. As I've shared, I was a high school teacher during that time, and I did a qualitative study at our school. So that's one of the reasons why we would use qualitative. A lot of qualitative is used in what's called action research. So action research is where you're conducting research on a particular situation, oftentimes in a large institution or in your classroom, and you're trying to implement some sort of action based off of your findings. So the reason that we would have this class is so that way we can understand educational processes and learn how to collect data and analyze it and help shape some sort of educational system, policy, or practice. So um, when you're trying to finalize and think about your research questions for this week, I really want you to think about that big topic first. Do you want to think about teaching? Do you want to think about learning? Do you want to research about high school? Do you want to research middle school? Do you want to research college? What do you want to research, right? Are you going to need to research a student, like ask a student interview questions? Are you going to need to ask a teacher? What are you going to need to do? Um, when you're developing a research question, remember you don't want double-barreled questions. So questions that have more than one research question in there. So for example, how do students and teachers make sense of online learning during COVID-19? Those are two different questions. They're related, but they would be, how do students who were in high school during COVID-19 make sense of their online learning? And then how do teachers who were teaching during COVID-19 make sense of their online teaching? Those are two different research questions, while related, and they could be a part of one study. You need to have one research question. And I would say focus in on just your one research question, and think about that. I did also post in, did post about scheduling an appointment with me as well. So that way, if you want to talk through these, we can do that. Um, Okay, so think about ethics and how you can frame your question in a way that would not push you to have to interview minors or any vulnerable population. Vulnerable populations are folks who like are incarcerated, and have historically been exploited. So a lot of times, disability is one, but that is debatable, and we can have conversations around that if you have some hesitations around that. And I say debatable not because exploitation has not taken place, but for instance, disability is a wide range, right? So if you want to interview somebody with ADHD and that's identifiable as a disability, that's a little different. So we can have, if you are questioning that, let me know. Remember, your research question should be answerable. So the idea is that you research, your research question is something that your findings can answer, your interview can answer. Think about how your research question. So research questions and interview questions are different. Please note that down, write that in a note or something, because your research question is the overall question that guides the design of your research. So your research question is guiding how and why you're conducting your research. It's the overarching question, the big picture question that you're trying to answer. Your interview questions are questions that are basically just tools to help collect data that will answer those. So your research question should be answerable. It should not be a yes or no question. So for example, the example I had earlier was, how do students make sense of their online learning during COVID-19, right? That's not a yes or no question. You're going to avoid yes or no questions, something like, do students think that online learning was effective? That's a yes or no question, right? Avoid those types of questions. It needs to be open-ended, so that way you can design your interview protocol or interview guides, which I'll get into a little bit more. Remember that this is qualitative, not quantitative, so you're not looking for a relationship between two variables. You're looking for those lived experiences. And again, I mentioned this in the last lecture, but we are not hypothesizing. That is something I will ask in the, I will have one to two code phrases, but I will ask you that in the, I will ask you, what are we not doing? And you're going to write, we are not hypothesizing. Or okay. So interviewing is a mode of data collection. And in our methodology, or our methodological approach, our methodology is the overall design of how we go about collecting data. And then the way that we talk about our methodology and we explore those is that we are looking at what methods we used for our methodology. So the methods are the different tools that we are using to collect our data. For this class, you're going to be doing primarily interviews and observations being field work or field notes. Sorry, not field work, sorry, field notes. So you're doing interviews and field notes as observations for data collection. So your data tools, your data research or your research tools are specifically interviewing and interviews and observations, or field, like, observations, as our field notes as observations. So this data collection, what happens is that you go and collect your data, and that in turn is your data. Data is not just numbers, and I will probably reiterate that a number of times. And you use that data now to answer your research questions. Our interviews in themselves are data. That is data. And the goal of interviews basically is to try to find some sort of central theme, or understanding on what's happening, in the context of your research questions. Now, we're using only narrative and case study for this, right? So we're not necessarily looking for themes to answer large sweeping questions, but we will be looking for central themes, within our data. And what happens is that in our data, somebody may say something at the beginning of the interview and then also say something later on toward the bottom of the interview, and those can go into one theme. We're trying to connect these to lived experiences and understand the facts and the meanings that are related to what they have to say. We're capturing information and experiences, understanding meanings, looking at their interpretations, right? Our participants' interpretations, not just our own. Um, Within the narrative design, we are trying to capture specifically, we're trying to capture specifically, the story aspect. So when you're thinking about how to write it up, you're going to think about the storytelling aspect of this. And that means that when you're writing your interview protocols or developing your interview protocols as well, one of the components is thinking about how can you have an open-ended series of questions that will allow them to tell you a story. So with that, in terms of storytelling, you can have something and say, so tell me a little bit about your experience as a first generation student, right? And that's good. That's very, very big, right? Or can you tell me tell me a really important story about your college experience. What is one story that stands out to you? So you want to have it open-ended, a series of questions that are open-ended to allow them an opportunity to really dig into the deep storytelling aspects of it. I will tell you too that you want to try to develop your interview protocol so your interview is for at least 45 minutes to an hour to really capture the context of, your um, research questions, to really answer those. And it goes by a lot faster than you realize. And that's why we're only doing one interview as well, because the transcription process can be kind of chaotic, and the analytical process, which I'll be getting into next week. So remember that narrative design is open-ended in storytelling. Meanwhile, case studies, you're trying to help understand a situation and take something away from that to be able to learn from it, right? So within that, you're going to think about the questions, so can you tell me a little bit about how you learn to teach about dialogue? And you're going to let them share that experience. And you can say, great, so what is your favorite part about teaching it? So you're going to have a series of questions that help answer a research question that is case study in design. So these are the two approaches that we're taking because of the fact that we are interviewing one person and we're trying to capture something. Phenomenological would require us to interview more people because we're looking for a particular social phenomenon. Action research we can't do because we're not implementing it. And ethnographic research, we're having an ethnographic component, because, well, there may be an ethnographic component because of the fact that you might capture some sort of like cultural norms in the classroom, right? Or cultural values. But in and of itself, it is likely not ethnographic in itself. That also relies on a lot of deep observations over a period of time, and further interviews, than just one person. So these are the two research designs, and I keep reiterating that too, because you're going to want to talk about why it's narrative or case study when you write your methodology paper. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about you as the interviewer. One of the things that you're going to think about is what your role is as the interviewer. You really need to remember that as an interviewer, your goal is to honor their lived experiences and their stories, right? And you are being put into a position where you're able to hold this information. So you need to be able to develop some sort of rapport or trust, and don't just be like shut off completely like from them. That doesn't mean that you need to be like their emotional support or be their buddy. That's not what's going on here. But you do need to be able to honor their experiences to some extent, right? Um, you're developing what's called a semi-structured interview guide or semi-structured interview protocol. Um, unlike surveys, surveys often will have some sort of set answer. Sometimes there's open-ended questions on a survey, right? But you're not developing surveys. So you're not trying to find some sort of short answer or short opportunity for them to just type and not be engaging. You need to think about this as kind of like a semi-structured conversation. So interviews are requiring some sort of probing and follow-up questions sometimes. In your interview guide and your questions, you should avoid yes or no questions. In some cases, yes or no's are acceptable, like background questions, for instance, but you really need to avoid yes or no questions. If you have to have one, you need to have a follow-up question or a probing question. So for example, if you ask, oh, so do you have your teaching credential? Yes. Okay, well, can you tell me a little bit about, your experience getting your teaching credential? Or, they say no, say, oh, well, can you share a little bit why you never got your teaching credential? You need to have follow-up questions for yes or no questions. That will be something that I will be looking for in the field notes, transcriptions, and analysis assignment, because part of that requirement will be for you to submit your interview guides as well. And if your transcriptions show that you only had yes or no questions, you're not digging into the deep elements of this. So you need to avoid yes or no questions. And if you do have them, make sure you have follow-up and probing questions. You also want to try to be conversational and professional, right? So it's really hard sometimes to go back and forth. So what I would suggest is after you develop your interview protocol, which again, I'm going to go into more detail, have a friend, sit with a friend and ask them questions. Tell them they can just make up stuff if it's not relevant to them to pilot it, because you want to try to be conversational yet professional, which basically means that you are asking the questions. You don't want to be shut off. So if they're like, yeah, I had this really hard time because I had a really, really, exploitative and kind of abusive principal, you're not going to say, oh man, that sucks. Like, he's terrible, and you don't want to do that, but you can acknowledge that it's hard. That must have been really hard. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, right? So you need to be professional, honor their experiences, make it conversational, but again, like, don't be unprofessional and don't sway the conversation. So one of the things that is really important is that while we are human and we do have positionalities and we cannot be completely unbiased in our analysis, we do need to attempt to not sway our participants from a particular direction to answer a question. So that means, go naturally to some extent, but also follow your interview protocol. So when you develop your interview protocol, and I'm going to show you an example, you're going to have an introduction, which you'll end up recording. And you'll have different sections, right? So they're sectioned off by different kind of themes or topics. So use the interview protocol to guide that, but don't cut them off either, right? Because what happens is that a lot of those side conversations, as long as it's still on topic, you're not talking about like your weekend or something, those are still producing relevant data. And if you cut those conversations off, you might be limiting your data to a very narrow focus. Allow those to kind of happen, but you also don't want to get so off track that you don't get to any or the rest of your questions. So let it go naturally, but try to keep it somewhat on track, which is why it's semi-structured. Semi-structured being partially structured, right? So you're allowing for flexibility, you're allowing for more things to emerge and come up, but you're not sticking to any rigid plan to where you're not letting other data come up or collect other data. Record your session. So take your phone, use Zoom, however it's going to be, and record your session. In the interview protocol, and I'll reiterate this when I show you the example, what you're going to do is you're going to have an introduction and you're going to let them know, I'm going to be recording, are you comfortable with recording the session? If they say yes, say, okay, I'm going to start the recording and then I'm going to ask you again on tape. So I am going to be looking for that in the transcripts, and I'm asking that you make sure you do that, because I want you to get into that practice. So that way, if you do conduct qualitative research or you work on a project or you use it for jobs, right, you're understanding kind of these ethical components to both protect your participants as well as yourself and make sure you have documentation too. So you are going to record your session. You need to record the session because I'm looking for transcripts. And I'll explain some tools that you can use for the transcripts in a little bit, but make sure you record the session. Now, if you're going in person, I would suggest bringing a pen or paper for you, or for yourself, or if you're doing it through Zoom, still maybe have a pen and paper. And I say this because I am asking for observations. Now, in some instances, observations might be a little tricky for you. I would say you need to think about observing either neighborhoods or people in their classrooms if you have access to that. If they have an online class, you can observe an online class. You can observe websites of schools if you think that like maybe school values are something that's important. You need to think about what can be observed. Now, if there's no way or observations are completely impossible, what you should do is if you're interviewing, especially in person, what you can do is capture all of the observations and notes before, during, and after the interview. So what you'll do is you'll take notes on the interactions, engagements, and that. You'll take notes on how they talk. You'll take notes on the sights and the sounds. So like, let's say I'm going to go interview somebody at Starbucks. I'm going to show up a little early and I'm going to sit down and I'm going to walk in, and ethnographic notes are super detailed. And I'm going to look around and I'm going to say, okay, on the wall, there's a clock and it says 3:22 p.m. Also, as a note for your interviews, as well as your field notes, I do apologize for kind of being all over. I just wanted to make sure I know this. You need to mark down the time that you start and the time that you end when you finish your interviews and or your observations. It's really important, along with your date. Okay. Now, back to the field notes. So if I sit in a Starbucks, I'm going to say it's 3:22 p.m. Blenders are whirring right now in the background. There's three other people in the store. Looking at the neighborhood, it's an upper middle class neighborhood that's in a very kind of urban area. There's a bus stop right outside. The chairs and benches are black with brown tables. It's incredibly cold in here. There's a community board, and on the community board, there is a community organization that supports trans students. There's another organization that is trying to put together a beach cleanup, and folks have their businesses posted on there, such as a massage therapy company, and there's a chiropractor here. So you're going to basically write down all of your observations. Ethnographic research and field notes are incredibly detailed. And so you're going to do that in the context of your interviews as well. I want you to have observations outside of those interviews, but if you're struggling on how to think about that, set up a meeting or send me an email or message me on Discord so I can help you with that. Now, when it comes to if it's Zoom, you still can do something similar. So I would suggest trying to keep your camera on so it welcomes the other person to keep their camera on. Document yourself. So write down what your thoughts are, how you're feeling, what you're thinking about what's going on. Put the starting and the ending times. Do your observations on what you're seeing, how they're engaging online, what they're doing. So you're going to want to note down all of the observations as well. But those will be very minimal, and that may not provide a ton of data. So again, see how you can think about an observation, whether you're walking around on a campus or you're looking on a website or what it might be, to add some field notes to collect some data. Okay, and then I would suggest that you start trying to find somebody who aligns with what you're doing. I will be posting a discussion board. It's a completely optional one, but the discussion board is going to be there for you to put down who you're trying to recruit for, if you don't have somebody in mind, and that way we can kind of piece some folks together if you need to. All right, so your code word right now is travel. The code word is travel. So the code word for this lecture is travel. Okay, so let's talk more now about interview protocol. So your interview protocol is a guide. It basically it's a document that you will have that you will submit, and the interview guide is interview protocol is the protocols and the guide in which you're conducting your interviews. Um, you'll introduce it. You'll have like an introduction, and I'll show you on the example that says, um, I'm going to be talking about this. This is a part of a project. You will say in there that, if you have any questions, you can reach out to me, which is you, or my professor, Dr. Holdenbrink Monk, at these emails about this interview. You're going to ask for consent, proceed, wrap up the introduction, and then you're going to say, I'm going to hit record. I'll ask you again. Like you're going to record after you start that. So basically, you'll say, do you mind if I record this? They say yes or no. They're going to probably say yes. Then you're going to introduce the topic and you're going to go from there. For your interview protocol, you're going to organize your protocol by topic. So if you're annotated bibliography, you're going to think about what some of the common themes and ideas and concepts come up in that annotated bibliography. Use that as a guide to help you organize the different topics or themes that are going to be in your interview guide. It's easier for you and for your participants to keep track and follow along in the interviews if you have some sort of organization that you're going to ask questions that you think are going to help with your research question, right? So if you have a research question on, why did students choose UCSD? You're not going to have a question on there say, well, tell me about your experience on online learning. That's irrelevant right now, right? So or at least that's not going to be the first question unless there is a relevancy. So you're going to want to make sure you have questions and topics that are going to help you answer your research question. That's kind of the whole point of this, right? Again, refer to your literature to help kind of guide the organization of this, see what comes up, what they say are in their findings, what some of the things are that they felt were missing. You can look for a section that says implications for future research or future research should include, have those types of things. Then in your interview protocol, you'll have a concluding statement. And sorry, it's not anonymity, it's more confidentiality of their data. It's anonymous to me, it's anonymous to others, but it's not really anonymity. It's confidentiality, ensure confidentiality of their data, but tell them that it will be anonymized for everybody else. So you're going to take away their identity, right? So when you're doing this and you're writing your transcripts, ensure that you do not put their real names. You can say participant because you're only interviewing one person, or you can come up with an alternate name for them. If you want to, you can also invite them to come up with an alternate name. So in terms of like ensuring confidentiality of their data, you can say, for the purpose of this, there will not be any identifiable traits attached to you. I will be coming up with a pseudonym. I was wondering if you have a preference of another name that is not your real name for this interview. So you want to ensure them that their data will not be, shared with anybody else other than you and me. And that way they feel more confident and comfortable. And I'll show you in the example again, kind of what this looks like. Okay, so again, now going to this, a lot of qualitative research, you're avoiding yes or no questions. So that's the same thing here now, because that is the same thing here. So just like your research questions, you avoid yes or no, same thing with interview questions. In some cases, they may be acceptable. Have follow-up or probing questions if you do need a yes or no. Generally, you want to avoid them. Remember that the intention of this is for rich and deep data, right? You're trying to collect large stories and experiences within there. You're building rapport. You need to, especially because they're being vulnerable. A lot of times they're being vulnerable with you. Our participants are. So build rapport like, hey, how's it going today? I really appreciate you doing this. Like build some sort of connection to some extent with them. Begin with questions that are easier to answer. So background questions that kind of set the tone. So you can say, how do you identify? Or what are some identities that you feel are relevant to your position as a teacher, right? So can you tell me a little bit about how long you've been teaching and what subjects you teach, or how long you've been teaching? Well, what subjects do you teach? So provide some background information. Start with the easier questions to build that rapport and kind of build the momentum. Now, while you're asking them questions, there's a couple of layers. The first is ask questions that are clear, write the questions that are clear, but be prepared to explain it in a different way if they don't understand your question, right? They may say, I'm not sure I understand what you're asking. Be prepared to be able to clarify that. but then also recognize that, we're all human and we want to honor our participant stories. So ask for clarification. Don't assume that you know what they mean. So for example, if somebody says, yeah, I administered the cast for the students, and I had to do this, and it was really stressful because on top of that we had to do our exhibition, right? And you just write that down and you have no idea what the cast is. Ask them, say, hey, would you mind giving me a little more detail on what the cast is? Like, what do you mean by that? It's okay to ask for clarifying questions, and it's better because you don't want to assume that you know what they're talking about, right? You want to ask them what the meaning is. What are they doing? Why, what do they mean, right? What do they mean? And you want to make sure that you represent it accurately. um, Pay attention to them. So I've had folks who have brought computers to interviews and they've shared, I did not pay attention to my participant. It was a lot harder than I thought, which is why I suggest a pen and paper. Jot down notes and thoughts here and there as you go through. So it can be your own notes and thoughts, right? Or like, oh, go back to this, or things like that. It can also be, oh, this is like that piece of literature that I read. Make sure you're paying close attention to your participants, though. You don't have to. So people talk about eye contact. Eye contact can be the expectation of eye contact can be ableist, so I'm not necessarily saying you have to make forced eye contact, but do pay attention to them, respond to them. If you do like eye contact, or you like doing that in terms of the engagement, you can do that. But just make sure you're engaging with the participants so they know that you're present, right? That they know that you are respecting their time and with you. Okay, some more. Avoid double-barreled questions as well with your interview questions. So you're not going to want to ask them, um, can you tell me about how your school supported you during online learning and how did it make you feel? Right? Don't ask it that way. Ask them as two separate questions. So tell me a little bit about how your school transitioned to online learning. Let them have an opportunity to talk. So how did you feel during that whole time? Right? Make sure that you are not having double-barreled questions. They should be separate questions. Remember that this is about their experiences, their perspectives, their opinions. Remember that you're focusing in on that. You are trying to find themes and concepts throughout the transcript. So just make sure that you have some organization, and that you're prepared to kind of follow up. Again, right, this is the kind of clarifying. And what may happen at some point is an element of what's called member checking. I think I have a slide for it. But that's where this idea of following up with them comes up. So if you're going through your data and there's something that you didn't clarify in the interview, it's okay to follow up with them and send them an email, or and send them an email and say, hey, would you mind explaining a little bit what you meant by this? It's okay to follow up with them. It's also okay if you want to send them the transcript and say, hey, is there anything in here you feel doesn't accurately and adequately represent who you are and what you said? It just, that is something that I will leave up to you depending on how confident you feel with the data. Okay, so now what? Let me say something now is that you should be jotting down analytic memos now before you've even started the interviews. The analytic memos there's nothing set in stone for analytic memos. I want you to start now because those analytic memos will be submitted for your final methodology paper. And if you feel there's a data component, you can use it, but regardless, the analytic memo will be expected to upload. Analytic memo is basically something where you can start from the very beginning. And this very first analytic memo that you start keeping track of is like your initial thoughts around the process. If you're still kind of thinking about what you want to focus on, jot those all down in your analytic memo. Think about it as like a diary, or like a research diary or journal. So just have the date on there when you start jotting these ideas down. Put down your initial thoughts about the process. Think about what data you maybe have stumbled across so far, or literature. There is no specific template or format for analytic memos. There really aren't, because it's very personal. It can be bullet points, it can be full-fledged paragraphs, it can be just kind of phrases. It's really up for you, and up to you. So make sure you at least have the date. That's the only thing I would say. Start keeping track of these analytic memos. What research questions are you thinking? Maybe have all of your research questions in there as you start refining them. Additionally, you might use this for your final data collection, or you might not. Um, Analytic memos may or may not be data in and of themselves. It really depends on what you do with it. Um, Regardless, though, once you get your interview, so write down some stuff now for your analytic memo. Jot down some thoughts in an analytic memo after your annotated bibliography. Jot down some notes in your analytic and in jot down an analytic memo after you conduct your interview, maybe even after you're doing your interview, as you're going through your interview guide. Um, but definitely do that, because you are not going to have your transcript fully transcribed and ready to go and analyzed yet, but you might think about, oh, they said this was a really big struggle. Go back into that, right? So you're going to go in there and have an analytic memo immediately after your interview with your thoughts, reflections, struggles, and everything on the experience. Now, once you've jotted down that analytic memo, you're going to transcribe the data. So you listen to your recording. You can include the ums, the uhs. You don't have to. Some people like to for the intention of, humanness. It's up to you. It doesn't matter to me. Just don't take out anything that is of substance that they've said. Even if it's a single sentence that you feel like isn't substantial, you need to keep that in. I just mean the ums and the uhs you don't have to keep in. When it comes to this, you basically you will have your recording going, and you in theory would just type out everything, but I'm going to suggest a couple of tools even if you're interviewing in person. So one thing to consider is Zoom. You can have Zoom running in the background if you're doing it in person, or you can have it running in the background if you're doing it through Zoom, obviously, or even if you're on the phone and you put yourself on speakerphone, for instance. Make sure if you do that, you're completely by yourself, because you won't want people to hear the data that you're collecting. And Zoom has a feature on there to where you can find the transcriptions of an entire meeting. So that's one option. Another option is Otter AI. So Otter AI can record, but it only records up to 30 minutes. So just be, cognizant of that. Another option is you can record it on your phone. And then if, like, for instance, you don't have access to a computer in the moment, or it's kind of clunky, you can record it on your phone. And what I've done in the past is then I just record, I have Zoom up, and then I have the conversation playing on my phone, and I record it through Zoom. So those are some options. And the reason I say this is that transcribing is an incredibly difficult process sometimes. And even if you have those, I cannot stress this enough. You need to still listen to the recording word for word. So even if you use Otter AI or Zoom to transcribe your data, you have to go through now and listen to the recording while you're reading your transcripts. I will be looking for this, because these processes are sometimes they're very problematic. They will say names wrong, they'll pronounce things incorrectly, and they'll read things, and they'll immediately convert a name. Let's say a name is not like an English name, like something that you would typically find in like the English language. It'll take a name, a culturally important name, and turn it into some random word. And that has happened, or before. So please make sure that you're listening to it word for word on like the recording, and you're reading through the transcription, even if you use Otter AI or Zoom transcriptions. You may or may not use member checking. Again, this is really dependent upon you and how well the transcription comes out. And that's where you go through the data with the person. And in your analytic memo, you might want to start thinking about just the initial thoughts right here, in terms of your initial patterns, and how those connect to the literature that you've seen so far in your annotated bibliography. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk a little bit about field notes. Field notes are typically taken in ethnographic research, but it can also overlap with other things. So you will be collecting field notes. There is no real template with this. There's a couple of different ways that people sometimes do their field notes. So sometimes they'll have, like, on the left side just their observations, on the right side kind of their initial thoughts. You don't have to do that. I don't do it that way. I tend to just throw all of my observations on a piece of paper, and then I reflect on it later. Um, the importance of field notes is that they are piecing together the different types of data. You're collecting different types of data, and field notes are data. So, for instance, if you're, let's say you were doing a classroom observation and you go in and you're going to like observe everything on the wall because that's going to be some of the cultural values of the classroom. You're going to observe the teacher and how they interact with the students. There's this wide range of things that you're doing, you're engaging with in terms of data. And you're trying to make sense of the different norms or practices or interactions or the nervousness or the anxieties and all the things, basically. Um, so you're going to make sense of the context, where you interview, who you interview, and how that interaction is taking place. And field notes do not have a specific template. But you are literally trying to write down and observe every single thing that you can. And that means like the art and what the art looks like. You're looking at how people are dressed. You're looking at how they're interacting. You're trying to observe all the little nitty gritty details. Okay. So kind of going on, what do I take notes on? Everything. You are going to include, you can include all the senses, all the smells, all the small things, all the big things, the colors, the details about the space, the location. You're using deep description. You're looking around outside. You're looking on the inside. Going back to that Starbucks, right? If you remember, I mentioned the bus stop outside. I mentioned all of the sounds inside of the blenders. I mentioned the interactions between two people. So you're looking at all of this stuff. This is called like the recording as much detail as possible is naturalistic observation because you are thinking about the context of everything. So it can be handwritten or electronic. So you can do recordings too. You can like record it as well if you'd rather not write it down. I would say handwritten is likely best, but I will leave it up to you. So if you're somewhere, you might want to just hit record and start just detailing it, and then but you will still have to write it down later. So you'll still have to transcribe those. So it's totally up to you. And when I say handwritten, I don't necessarily mean pen and paper, which those can be helpful though because it's a little less invasive sometimes. But it can be typed, it can be recorded, your voice recording, or it can be handwritten. Okay. So that's that for the lecture slides. What I want to do is I want to go through a little bit now and show you the examples that are um, on. Okay, so a couple of things to consider when you're doing your field notes. It's not a summary. Yeah, you're not just saying, uh, you know, so and so showed up at this time and she was nervous. Um, you're also not trying to make assumptions, so you're describing. So instead of saying she was nervous, which is your own kind of interpretation, you can say she was shaking her leg, she bit her lip, her finger was tapping lightly on the table as she shifted her glances around the room. Her left loose shoe would shake every time she moved her leg. She has a look of worry on her face, her eyebrows furrowed. It was clear she was nervous. So you're trying to capture, again, the details, right? It's deep description. I can't stress that enough. You're looking for deep description of what's happening. So it's not intended to just be a summary. So when you're taking your notes, right, you're jotting things down as well. So what we're seeing, feeling, observing, you want to be detailed. They don't have to be complete sentences. So I know that this one here, obviously there are complete sentences, but you can also say shaking leg, blue shoes moving, biting lip, right? They don't have to necessarily be a complete thought either. So you're not going to say she was worried, she was nervous with that. You're jotting down the details, yes, you could also note what you were thinking in the moment about how you might want to analyze it or what the analytical process might be or what types of things or concepts come up. So it's a matter of taking notes in the moment on, on everything. Okay. So sorry, I have two more. A couple of thoughts and considerations is the idea of participation versus observation. So if you were in a classroom, for instance, you might be invited to help the teacher or support the teacher. That's participant observation. It is hard to write notes down, right? You can't really write notes down when you're observing. But what I would suggest, if that is something that you end up doing, take a notebook with you. Or if you go into like a college class or a lecture hall, take a notebook or a computer with you. But you want to be respectful of the professor, right? So if they have like a no, something that's like outside, just be cautious of that. Participation versus just purely observation. Participant observation is where you're observing as a participant, while observation is you are not a participant. You want to think about your interpretation, so avoid assumptions, right? He was very shy versus he did not speak much. Maybe shy, but maybe not too. So you want to be cautious of assumptions. Consider the ethical considerations. So you're not just going to go to a random park and start jotting down all of the information about a kid and minors, right? For as one example, you want to make like you don't necessarily have to like you could go to like the middle of UCSD, for instance, and start jotting down notes. But you also don't want to have any of their identifiers in there, right? So, oh, he said her name. He said her name. Hey, Sarah, and then go from there. So you want to think about some of those ethical considerations. Sometimes photographs are appropriate. So I do encourage you and invite you to do those if you'd like. That's called visual qualitative research oftentimes. But if you don't have any pictures of people. You shouldn't have any pictures of people. Now, that is allowable in other settings. If we were going through the IRB process, that would be different, but we're not. So just make sure that you are aware of that. But you're going to want to consider, you know, the way that you can use these different tools to your advantage and to help collect data. Okay, so I want to kind of wrap it up with two thoughts. So this on this slide, which you have access to these slides, here's just one example, some field note templates. There is no real, okay, there are templates people have created, yes, but I don't have a particular format that I'm looking at with you for you. Let's talk a little bit about your annotated bibliography now. So your annotated bibliography, you're going to want to have a cover page. So your cover page in APA format. Everything is in APA format. I don't grade super strict and hard on this, as in if there's a comma out of place or something, you get points marked down. But your works cited, for instance, should not be all centered. It should not be center justified, for instance. Your whole paper should not be center justified. Those are things that I will be looking at in terms of all of this class. You want to do your best for APA formatting. So have a cover page with your name, right? Like the tentative title of your paper. You can just put untitled qualitative paper for now. Your name, right? Your class, your professor, and the date. Have a cover page. Then you're going to go in. So you're going to have your articles, like the APA citation of your articles. APA citation machine is great. You can just plug in the journal, you can put in the information, but you need to double check it to make sure that it is in fact in APA 7 format though, because while it's great, it can be a useful tool. You want to make sure that you do at least want to double check it. When you're going to introduce the article briefly, sorry, this should be flipped. So, okay, let's go through order. Cover page first. Then you're going to have a problem statement. So what that problem statement is like, what is the problem, the issue, or the major focus that you're going to have? So that's the very first thing you have is a problem statement. I had some things that were posted on how to write a problem statement. And essentially, it's just like a couple of sentences to a paragraph that I'm looking for to explain COVID-19 rocked the world, right? Everybody went online. We understand that there was a huge need for new and innovative teaching practices. We've come up with a lot of new practices since then, but literacy rates are still really low. So this paper is going to explore what some practices teachers have, what practices a teacher has been using to help bring up reading scores for their fifth graders, right? So a problem statement, just a singular statement. Then you're going to go into the actual annotated bibliography part, have the citation first of the article, then have a brief summary of what it's about, talk about what gaps they're trying to fill, what were their methods. They interviewed 10 people, they interviewed 3 people, they did observations, what was it? Talk about what their significant findings were, how do they connect it to theory. I'm not looking for pages and pages and pages per article. I would say, make sure that you can exemplify that you read the article, but try not to have more than like half a page dedicated to each article. I don't want this to be over the top stressful. You should be reading them. Read the abstract, go through, read the abstract, make sure that you understand it, and then dive into the rest of the article. You do want to have your annotated bibliography. I did share a link in Canvas for that, as well as I will have the details in the assignment for you as well. But you're going to want to make sure that you have all of these elements in there to the best of your ability as you're going through and writing your annotated bibliography. Okay, so now I'm going to go into the example. Okay, so this is the example. This is from a research project that this is from a research project that I did years ago with a writing partner of mine. So what we were looking at specifically, our research question was how do teachers, uh, how do teachers exemplify their teaching philosophies in their syllabus? And so what we were trying to figure out was like, is a teaching philosophy present in the syllabus or not? So we analyzed a bunch of syllabi, we analyzed a lot of syllabi, and then we interviewed teachers. And, for me, what I did was I would say, hey, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate that. How you doing? I'm not like buddy buddy, but just, how are you doing? Great, etc. Then I would say, do you mind if I record this? I'm going to say that again on record. If you say yes, they'd say yes. And then I would go in. You're being interviewed because you expressed interest in an interview when you submitted the syllabus to a study. For you, you could say you're being interviewed because you expressed interest when I reached out to you, or whatever it might be. You'll be asked questions that reflect your educational background, professional development, and perspectives. Yours need to be specific to yours. You will be asked questions that will reflect on your time as a high school student during COVID-19, whatever the purpose is, right? You're going to explain if there's a definition you need to explain, you can share that here. There are no right or wrong answers. I'm just hoping to understand this. What you share today will not be connected with your name. Make sure that this is relevant. So like officer school may not be relevant to everybody, but you will say, that it's not connected. It will not be, it's only being recorded for the purpose of transcription, etc. You're going to say, we want to get a better understanding of whatever it might be. Your interview, you should say this interview is designed to not take place more than 45 minutes to an hour. And kind of leave it at that. You'll notice that we have a section off. So this first section was the background on the teacher. Then the second section here was on specifically teacher education. So what was their educational background? Third section was the philosophy of teaching here. Fourth section, you'll see that the questions are here. So here, this right here was a yes or no, because not everybody will have the opportunity to explore dialogical professional development opportunities. So this is why we have the probe how if they said yes. If they said no, what I sometimes would do was say, have you ever, what have you learned about dialogue outside of that? Something to those things. Remember that this guide is more yours, so that's why like this, for instance, isn't capital, and we understand what PD stands for when we did this. So we had this sectioned off by different topics, and then the questions underneath. I am looking for sections. I'm going to say that again. I am looking for sections. You need to have an organization. So just 10 questions or 15 questions slapped up on a document is not going to be helpful. You need to have it sectioned off by different topics. So please make sure that you do that. The next code word is typewriter. Okay, so again, make sure that you have an introduction, and then you have sections here. And remember that your interview guide is just one tool, and it's being used and designed to help you make sense of to answer your research question, right? That's what you're trying to do. You're trying to answer your research question. So on Canvas, there's a variety of resources for you. Make sure that to kind of wrap this thought up, make sure that you work on your annotated bibliography and that you start writing analytic memos. The analytic memos will be helpful for you also in your methodology paper, because that requires super duper details, and your analytic memos help you keep track of all of the details and thoughts that you went through. And you basically can just use that to kind of help guide things. So please let me know if you have any questions, and schedule those appointments with me if you have them.